guys, it's been a long week, and it's only Wednesday. So I decided that some serious popcorn reading was in order. And clearly, I don't already have enough books on my shelves that I bought because they sounded like fun at some point. So I bought two more. The first one I got on Kindle because it was only $1.49, and that is The Shining by Stephen King. It can't get much more popcorny than that, can it? Most of you are probably at least vaguely familiar with the plot of this book, either because you've read it or because you've watched the movie. But I myself didn't know at all what it was about until very recently, so I'm going to talk a little bit about it for the benefit of all those who are like me and who sometimes have pop culture classics like that pass them by completely. So, The Shining is the story of one small family, father, mother, and son, who move to a hotel in a remote location in the Colorado mountains for one winter season because the father has taken on the job of caretaker for the hotel, and it's his job to make sure that the heating is working, that the hotel stays heated all through the winter, and that the heating system doesn't explode. But once the hotel closes for the season, everybody leaves, guests and staff, and the family will be the only people there, and they will be snowed in as well. The previous caretaker's family met an untimely end when the father got struck by what seemed like an unfortunate case of cabin fever and murdered his whole family. But the reader immediately suspects that something more sinister went down there because the whole the whole story has a paranormal touch from the beginning, because the new caretaker's son, his 5-year-old son, has something that in due course I think is going to be called The Shining, and it means that he can see dead people. And sometimes the dead people show him visions. And where I am in the book, about 15% in, he has already been shown a vision of history repeating and his father having a violent episode in the hotel. Like I just said, I'm about 15% in, and so far everything still feels like an introduction. The family have only just arrived at the Overlook Hotel and are being shown around, and so far it's all been family history and the individual characters' histories. And I quite like it so far. I like the characters. The father is problematic but sympathetic, and he, I think, is the main character because although all three family members, mother, father, and son, are point of view characters, we spend by far the most time in the father's head. Speaking of viewpoint characters, what I find a little bit irritating is that the narration very often jumps very quickly from character to character. Sometimes we get told whole chapters from the point of view of just a single person, but in other chapters, the viewpoint changes from paragraph to paragraph, and I find that a little bit jarring, and I hope it doesn't happen too often. But other than that, I'm really liking it. I have mixed feelings about Stephen King's oeuvre as a whole, but he sure knows how to write a compelling story. And the second book that I bought, and which you watched me pick up earlier, is Vicious by V.E. Schwab. Yes, I caved and bought a V.E. Schwab novel. She is such a big name in fantasy, and her books are so hyped, and that alone makes me a little bit wary of her. I'm certainly not going into this with any expectations of having my mind blown by the writing or the sheer originality of it all, but I do expect some compelling storytelling nonetheless. And I'd like to point your attention to the cover image too, because you might only have seen the cover from afar so far, and you may not have seen what is actually shown on the cover image. As you can see, these black bars are bones, but underneath them there is text. The cover is filled with text that has been redacted. It's been blacked out by these black bars in the shape of bones. I never realized that until I picked the book up today, and I think it's very cleverly done, and I'm curious to see what this text is all about. But I haven't told you what the book is all about. It's the story of two friends, two college roommates, who discover in a science experiment that people who come back from the dead or have had near-death experiences sometimes come back with extraordinary abilities. However, on the minus side, they come back slightly changed as well and seem to be lacking something. And therein, I think, lies the source of the conflict that is going to develop between the two former best friends. It just sounds like an extremely fun romp, and this is exactly what I'm looking for right now. So I will update you in due course about how I get on with it. In the meantime, I have some recent reads and some lunchtime reading to talk about. Hi guys, lunchtime has finally come, and I'm sitting here with Feet in the Clouds, the fell running book, a history of mountain running in Britain interspersed with memoirs and anecdotes by the author, who is a modest fell runner himself. The chapter that I'm about to start is called A Long Day's Journey into Folly, and it's apparently about the author's beginnings in fell running. And the first sentence is, "It began for me on a grey, blood-chilling Saturday, the kind of day with which, oddly, many a love affair between man and mountain has begun." Guys, this is so relatable. His description of how he was drawn out of London into the mountains and into the fresh air, having had enough of jogging in the polluted air in London. This is so relatable to me. His tone is also very funny and self-deprecating. I'm loving this book so far. It's just exactly the right combination of topic and tone for me so far. So as you could see, I'm enjoying my lunchtime reading a lot. But from the weekend onwards until only yesterday, I actually had a different book for lunchtime reading. And that was Go Tell It on the Mountain by James Baldwin. of which I have now read the first of 3 parts, the first 65 pages or so. And it's very good, but I need a break from it right now. Depicts the life of a family in the 1930s in Harlem. And this first part that I read is told from the perspective of the oldest son of the family, a 14-year-old boy. The family father is a preacher in a storefront church in Harlem, where a community of deeply devout, not to say fanatic, religious people from the neighborhood congregate. The family is, like most families at the time, I guess, basically an authoritarian regime, but this one maybe a little more so than most others because the father is so devout and bordering on fanatically religious. Like in any Orthodox church or a cult, there are particularly strict rules, and the father is particularly strict and also sometimes brutal in enforcing these rules because, of course, they are divine rules, and it is God's will that he is defending by enforcing these rules. And now the boy, on his 14th birthday, which is when the book opens, begins to realize that not only does he not want to lead the life that his father is leading, but he also begins to realize that it is stifling him already. And that if nothing changes, maybe in a few years, there will be nothing left of him, no spirit left in him, paradoxically. And he has seen that happen with other boys and young men from the church. It's very good, but it's slow going. This is Baldwin's first novel, I think, and it's a little bit clunky, especially in comparison with the only other one of his novels that I've read, which is Giovanni's Room, which is marvelously smooth and efficient in its narration. So I'm taking a little break from this one and going with a nonfiction book for now for my lunchtime reading. And I've come to realize that this theme of generational conflict and or the conflict between a new and relatively liberal lifestyle and an old conservative, repressive, or at the very least conventional one is also the main theme, I would say, in the short story collection by Carlos Fuentes from the 1960s that I finished sometime last week. The conflicts in these stories are sometimes between parent and child generation, but also between members of the same generation, or even between parent and child, or old and young person, but with reversed roles, where the older person's lifestyle actually seems more liberal than that of their youngish but rather stuck up neighbor. And sometimes that old way of living can be far more dangerous, in fact, than that of the specter of the lawless hippie that is always evoked by the reactionary forces. But actually, the new lifestyle doesn't go unexamined and uncriticized in this volume either. So it's a really well composed and well balanced collection in this way. For me personally, like I already mentioned in an earlier video, the stories were for the most part a little bit too mundane, and I think that especially in the year 2021, these themes don't have the same kind of impact on their readers, and don't hold the stories don't hold the same kind of fascination dealing with these themes. For some reason, for me, Carlos Fuentes has always been the least interesting of the four great writers of the boom of Latin American literature. And it seems that my intuition was right. I'm not sure if I'll pick up anything by him in the future. But staying with the theme of conflict between the generations in the 1960s, I then picked up Taking Woodstock, the memoirs of Elliot Tiber, who almost by accident came to be involved in the organization of the famous Woodstock Festival from 1969, which did not, in fact, take place in Woodstock, but 40 miles away from it in the Catskills, where Tiber's parents owned a rundown motel. During the summer seasons, Tiber used to help his parents keep the rather doomed motel business afloat, but he had a second life, which he thought about as his main life, in New York City as an artist. And he also got around in the gay scene in New York City. And this other life of his, by way of this New York City life, he got into contact with the organizers of the Woodstock Festival. Now, these organizers had their permits for the festival rescinded at the last minute by the town on the grounds that it would put too much of a strain on the environment. But of course, the real reason was that the townsfolk got cold feet and were afraid of that their town would be overrun by crazy hippies. And when Tiber heard of this, he said, "Hey, I've been running this little arts and crafts festival in my own town for a couple of years now, and I have a festival permit. So why don't we move the Woodstock Festival to the fields behind my motel?" And of course, the organizers pounced on this opportunity, and with just a month to spare, they moved the whole festival from Woodstock to the fields behind the motel, and of course got into their own war with the reactionary townsfolk in the new small town. So this book could have been great big fun. Unfortunately, I thought that the author was just insufferable. He's an awful poser, and he styles himself as this great visionary artist and this free soul who is being stifled by his parents' business plan and having to help his parents with their businesses all the time, when in fact you get the impression that in reality he's just an opportunistic businessman through and through, with just this facade of the New York City artistic party animal. But the most annoying thing was his endless name dropping of artists and of activists. He writes about Stonewall in one chapter and kind of makes it sound like he was majorly involved without actually saying so, because that, I guess, would have been just a blatant lie. And yeah, all the names of all the artists that he always met, it's ostensibly to paint a picture of the art scene and of the gay scene in New York City at the time. But it's so obvious that it's only self-serving name dropping. It's so cringy. And it gets really distasteful too, because he also drops names when, in my opinion, it's really inappropriate to do so, because he could have done what he ostensibly set out to do, namely to give you a picture of the gay scene in New York City at the time. He could have done that without naming actual names. Like, he says stuff like, "Oh, I remember that one time when Tennessee Williams and Truman Capote came over to my place and I had to put on my police uniform costume and handcuff Truman Capote and ordered him to suck my dick." Like, was that really necessary? Was it necessary to name Truman Capote by his name? Like, yes, the guy is dead, it can't hurt him anymore, and he's kind of our shared cultural heritage, but I just thought that it was in bad taste and just not the gentlemanly thing to do, is it? Don't kiss and tell. Don't cuff and tell, I guess. These things were just cheap and distasteful. I actually started reading this book it could have been 10 years ago, and I remember that I put it down again after 10, 15 pages, and just because I did not enjoy the author's voice and just what he was describing and the way he was describing it. And I picked it up now knowing that I wouldn't enjoy it and treating it just like a historical document, a source for the time, albeit a very, very unreliable and biased source. One of the more unreliable and biased ones that I've read, and I have read a lot. So these are some of the things that I've read and have been reading recently that are not popcorn reading. So now back to the vlogging and the light entertainment. Guys, I just filmed a short video talking about wishes in the same spot where I also filmed that short clip with the nearly 360-degree sweep of the sky and the treetops that you saw just now. But the clip doesn't have any sound. So here I am back at my place and giving it another go. That means that I embarrassed myself for nothing in front of several people who came passing by. I mean, people talk to their phones all the time, especially right now, but it's still different. The angle is different, and people can tell, I think, that you're not talking to another person, but that you are filming yourself. Anyhow, onto wishes. I haven't made huge progress, to be honest. I've been so tired this week. I usually fell asleep almost the second that I went horizontal, and at the latest 2 or 3 pages into the book that I was reading. But I think I'm far enough into the story to have gotten a feel for it. And I have to say that I'm afraid that this is more or less exactly like I anticipated. It's fast-paced reading, but there's very little substance to it. It's told in a dual timeline narrative with one of the two college friends, the two guys who met in college as roommates, with one of them as the main character. He is the viewpoint character in the past storyline, and well, the viewpoint is a little bit all over the place in the present time storyline, but he is certainly the main character there as well. And in the past storyline, we hear about how the two boys conceived of the science experiment that I talked about earlier, with which they are going to prove the existence of people with extraordinary abilities, and they are also going to get to the bottom of where these extraordinary abilities have their origins and how they come into existence. I already mentioned in my short summary earlier that this has to do with near-death experiences and or coming back from the dead. The present day storyline, with that we are 10 years later, and the main character, who is somewhat unnecessarily named Victor, has just come out of prison, and we first meet him, the very first chapter, which takes place in the present time storyline, is set on a cemetery where Victor is digging up a body. And that, of course, it makes the whole story extremely intriguing, because we wonder immediately what it was that made this nice and relatively sweet college kid, what turned him into somebody who has just come out of prison and is digging up bodies in a cemetery. And the narrative then jumps between the two timelines, with the present day storyline moving a little bit slower than the past storyline. And in addition to creating tension and suspense, this jumping around between the timelines with very short chapters also creates the impression of speed in the narrative as well as in the reading experience. I'm liking this book so far. It's just a nicely mindless reading experience at the moment. However, I'm not loving it. I'm relatively indifferent towards the characters and their fate. And I think the reason for that is that it's also superficial. We spend almost no time at all on exposition and on introducing the characters and their backstory and their relationship. We are told that they have become, I'm not sure if we are even told that they've become best friends, but it's suggested. But they certainly have a close friendship and they are each other's confidants. They also have a little bit of rivalry going on, so sometimes they almost seem to be frenemies. But this is all just suggested in passing, and I think the book would have benefited from delving into this a little bit more deeply, because since I got to know so little about the characters, the stakes are very low for me. They are just some strangers for me, and I'm not really emotionally invested. What could have salvaged it would have been a high dose of humor, but there's very little humor in this, and I think it's at the moment it almost feels like a missed opportunity. So it's by no means bad, and I was obviously looking for a relatively mindless reading experience, and this is certainly what I got with this book. So no hard complaints here. But it almost wouldn't be a week in the life of this booktuber if I didn't also have a couple of surprise new books that I can show you that have entered my bookshelves this week. And one of them you actually already saw in a short clip. It was one that I found in a public bookshelf, little free library, if you like, although it is anything but little. The book is The Bonfire of the Vanities by Tom Wolfe. This is a satirical novel from the 1980s. It's a courtroom drama about a millionaire, billionaire, extremely rich guy who is on trial for a hit and run in the Bronx. It's a satire about society, class, racism, politics in general. And it's supposedly inspired by Thackeray and Dickens. I mean, the title is already a little bit reminiscent of Thackeray. And um, what it has in common with Dickens's novels, other than its broad scope, is that it was originally published in serial form in Rolling Stone, but it was heavily edited for the novel version. And the second new book that I got was a late Christmas present from a friend whom I meant to meet at Christmas, but it didn't work out. And we only just this week managed to mail us our respective Christmas presents to each other. And the book is one from my wish list. It's Moonrise by Sarah Crossan. This is a children's book, or I don't know, maybe a very young adult book. It's about a boy whose older brother is on death row, and now the date for his execution has been set. It's not what you expect from the cover, is it? The original hardcover edition looks very different anyway. And I hadn't realized this. I only realized it yesterday when I opened the present and had a look into the book. But it's written in, I hesitate to say verse because I always think that a novel in verse is a bit of a wrong term for this kind of writing. It's a novel in verse would be the Iliad or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This kind of book is more like a text that is made of poems, or leastways the paragraphs are made to look like poems. I hope that this isn't just superficial and that there's actually a good reason for all these line breaks and whatnot. I really do hope so. It's supposed to be absolutely heartbreaking, and I hope that for me it doesn't end up to be just annoying. I think this is going to be a very fast read too, and I'll pick it up on a rainy afternoon when I feel like having a good cry. So this is a wrap for this video. I'll let you know what I ended up thinking about both Vicious and The Shining once I've finished them both. And I'll see you again very soon with another video. Until then, have a nice sunny weekend, guys. Bye!